Hello everyone, my name is Jordan Lee and today we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War. As you can see right here, this is a statue that honors the people who gave their lives in Miami-Dade County and who have fought to the very end. And here we will get to the bottom of why this conflict was so controversial and how it divided a country for 20 years and what were the controversies that were taken to even get to have our nation leave after 2 decades of brutal fighting and unnecessary deaths according to most of the people in this nation. And without further ado, let us get started and explore. The Vietnam War was a conflict that pitted the communist North Vietnam government against the anti-communist government of South Vietnam. To get a better understanding, we have to look back at when Vietnam was taken under control of by France for rice and rubber, including its neighbors Laos and Cambodia, thus forming French Indochina. Like any other nation, the Vietnamese disliked being under the rule of another country, as shown when French colonists grew rich, while Vietnamese farmers became poor as a result. During the Second World War, when Vietnam was invaded by Japan, a political leader named Ho Chi Minh created his Viet Minh Army to fight off both the Japanese invaders and then the French colonists. The USA was worried about the domino theory, where if Vietnam fell communist, all of Asia would soon follow. America helped France on its side to fight against the communists, but the Viet Minh continued to claim victory each time. 1954 marked the end of French Indochina with the signing of a treaty at the Geneva Conference. This divided the nation, with the North as communist and the South as a democracy. The Soviets used this opportunity to spread its influence to the North in hopes of beginning a new Red Scare, this time in Southeast Asia. The Americans, however, sent advisors and money to prevent a communist domino theory from taking effect in a weakened democratic state. They did it peacefully without going to war at first, but all that changed when a ship sank at the Gulf of Tonkin that was torpedoed by the North Vietnamese in 1964. For a decade, no one thought anyone would attack the Americans when stationed there at all. Immediately, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and then asked Congress for permission to begin military action in Vietnam. First came early bombings from the air in an effort to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Then 175,000 troops were participating in the war on the side of the USA. Many people thought this war would conclude fast, as their military branches were equipped with higher technologies and a high-octane advancement in modern warfare. Then came a huge problem where the big battles were fought in the dense swamps and jungles, which the USA wasn't experienced in fighting on. To make matters worse, North Viet Cong soldiers fought a war using guerrilla warfare by staging booby traps, sneak attacks, and massive suicide bombings on the tiny divided nation. News and TV magazines captured these actions on the news and articles for news magazines, which horrified Americans. They also witnessed innocent civilians getting killed in the crossfires of the conflict. Eventually, Americans took to D.C. to protest against the war, where it would often be peaceful and sometimes escalate to unlawful assemblies. Some people still believed in the war's cause, while some didn't like the idea in the first place about getting involved. President Johnson later stepped down as president in 1969 because of the war and refused to run again because of the conflicts that divided America at home. He also blocked more troops from going overseas in order to not make matters worse than they already are. Richard Nixon, the new president, then pulled out troops in 1973 to avoid more uneasy tensions. The fighting between the North and the South continued for the next 2 years, despite a peace agreement. Without American support, South Vietnam fell in 1975, and the North invaded the South, making the nation under communist rule, including neighbors Laos and Cambodia, who were also former French Indochina colonies. To further add insult to injury, the communists renamed South Vietnam's capital, Saigon, to Ho Chi Minh City, and thus began the mass immigration and evacuation of Vietnamese civilians who were on a last-ditch effort to escape the new Red Scare sweeping their homeland. Some settled in Europe, while others went to North America by boat. The USA lost 58,200 troops, as shown in the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, later unveiled in 1982 at Washington, D.C. Since then, Vietnam switched to a market economy where business is run by the supply and demand in an economic system. In 1995, 20 years after the fall of Saigon, the USA normalized relations with Vietnam and are currently strong and growing partners in business of import and export. I am here joined by a former Marine in the Vietnam Veterans War. His name is Mr. Robert Denman. Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm just fine.
First off, thank you for your service, and since the 4th of July, let's all be patriotic.
Amen.
Okay, my first question is, what circumstances led you to being drafted in the Vietnam War, and how old were you when you started to fight?
I wasn't drafted. I joined the Marines. I graduated from high school at age 17. I knew that the selective service draft registration was at 18, and I had no plans on going to college. So I knew I was going to be drafted. And at that time, the only service that drafted was the United States Army. So I went down and joined the Marines at age 17. I went to Vietnam at age 17. But at 17, you could not see combat until you were 18. So I didn't see any combat operations until I was 18.
World War II veterans or the ones from before, like in the Civil War, mainly like former president, or the late former president, I should say, George H.W. Bush. He was the youngest and he was man enough to go to war in World War II. But for you, it's almost like the same thing, but you guys are different generations. Quite interesting.
Yeah, they just moved. You couldn't do any fighting until you were 18. You could go to a war zone, but you couldn't fight till you were 18.
That's nice. All right. So, can you tell us which battles you fought in and briefly explain what was the fighting all about in the conflict, like the biggest battles?
Well, they weren't called battles. Battles were back in World War II. They were called operations. So there was a lot of operations that ran simultaneously at the same time. Example I had to go back to my record and look at some of these. In early January of 1968, there was an operation called Badger Catch. It was in the Quang Tri Valley province, and it was a search and destroy mission along the Chu Vet River. So what we were doing is flying in the helicopters, search and destroy, to protect the Navy boats, the river boats that were going up on the rivers. And then simultaneously, there was Operation Hugh City. That was the Tet Offensive. So I was in Hugh City, which was a religious city. You couldn't shoot into the wall, anything, because it was like a shrine for the South Vietnamese. So we had to do other type of missions to get the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong out of Hugh City. That lasted until March. Tet Offensive did. So doing one mission into another, everything led around the clock. So you didn't have time to say, well, I'm going to do this operation over this operation. Because simultaneously in February of 1968, that went all the way through September of 1968, was an operation called Houston. That was an open search and destroy mission in the Da Nang Valley and the A Shau Reservoir. Though, as a crew chief on a helicopter, we were assigned to what they call a hot pad. So if soldiers in the field needed helicopter air support, we would go in on a given notice. So you were on 24-hour hot pad, you would rest a day. 24-hour hot pad, rest a day. That mission, with other missions, lasted until the end of September of 68. And that was through Fubai and and through Da Nang. But at the same time was Operation Nepal and Saline. That operation started in February of 68 and ran all the way through October of 68. That was in the Quang Tri Valley province, and it was strictly search and destroy. So as a crew chief on a helicopter, we would take Marines into a zone, drop them off, and then we would do air support cover for those Marines on the ground. Then you had the Asha Quang Tri operation, which was another search and destroy that went all the way into 1969. There were like two missions there because there was also Operation Robin that was part of the same thing, but there were two. The Army did one side and the Marines did the other side. One of the biggest amphibious assaults was Operation Bold Marina. That went into, it was an amphibious assault supported by helicopters, ground Marines, because Marines are famous for assaults like in, Iwo Jima, Midway, those things. And that was a search and sweep operation to support the landing force. Biggest amphibious assault since World War II. That was a biggie. I left Vietnam in 1970. And then in 1975, I was called back to Vietnam to do two major operations. One of those operations was called Eagle Pole. When the collapse of South Vietnam was imminent, we went in to evacuate the people in Cambodia that were supporting this. They were called the Mountain Yard people. They would oversee the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which we went to every day, the Asha Valley and the trail. We flew missions there every day. Well, we wanted to protect those Mountain Yard people, so we went into Phnom Penh and evacuated as many as we could. That started in April of 1975. It only lasted 2 days. And then we turned the Navy task force around and we went in 29th and the 30th of April in an operation called Frequent Wind. That's when we actually evacuated the U.S. Embassy and all friendlies, even nationals from third countries, out of Saigon.
Yeah,
that's the ones that I can remember.
The thing you told me about a decade ago when I asked you about this, you have to remember in this conflict there was no DMZ like in Korea, so it made it easier for them to fall, which we'll get to a little later.
I missed what you said.
About the DMZ, like they don't have one in Vietnam like they have in Korea.
No, there wasn't. The problem with Vietnam is you had the regular North Vietnamese. They wore a uniform. They were trained soldiers. But then you had the Viet Cong. It would almost be like a local militia, let's say. They didn't wear any uniforms. They would use the Ho Chi Minh Trail every night to bring ammunition down and store it in villages. We would do search and seizure missions, fly into a zone, drop Marines off. They would go to the villages and they would look for stashes of ammo. It wasn't the villagers' fault because at that time, the Viet Cong, not the North Vietnamese RVN regular soldiers, but the Viet Cong would go into a village and tell the chief of that village, you will store these weapons and this ammo for us, and we're going to take all your rice. And if you don't do it, we're going to kill the chief of the village, which they killed many of them. So we would do search and rescue to do one, try to get that village back to our side, and two, find the stash of weapons that they had, and then we would destroy those weapons in place. Because if we didn't destroy them in place, then when the VC came back to that village looking for their stuff, they would have wiped the village out.
Wow,
and this was every single day, 24/7. And why were they stashing all of these arms into these villages? They did it in preparation for the Tet Offensive in '68. It was the biggest all-out conflict of Vietnam. The North Vietnamese regulars and the VC attacked every military base in South Vietnam, every port of entry. And they did it on like our New Year's. The Tet is their New Year's. So nobody expected it.
but that's new to me. This is something that I didn't even know about, but thanks for sharing. And now I want to ask about the jungles and the swamps. While you were fighting, they were moist and treacherous, full of traps. And can you describe what they were, and if you fell into one of them with your crew, and plus the injuries if you received them from combat?
Well, I was flying in a helicopter, so I was never on the ground. So I knew there were bungee sticks and all kinds of things on the ground. Now, my time over there, I was shot down in a helicopter 4 times. And we had to walk out with the ground Marines or Army who was ever there to support us. Now, I didn't see any bungee sticks. I didn't see any of that. It was miserable getting out, but flight crew didn't see that. That was more of the infantry type guys on the ground.
Oh wow, that's new and pretty interesting to learn about. That's for sure. And there was also a hidden figurehead I never asked you before ruling Vietnam. His name was Bao Dai, the last emperor. And if you know why he was in power and overthrown, can you tell me what were the reasons behind his disposition? Because people rarely talk about him. They mostly care about the French and Ho Chi Minh and America.
Well, that I don't know who he is, because when I got there, he wasn't there. You had Ho Chi Minh was north, and then you had the president of South Vietnam, who we actually, when I flew in '75, I extracted him and the U.S. ambassador out of Saigon. He was on my chopper. So I don't know the politics behind that. I do know why we were there. We were there to stop the spread of communism.
And also, do you think the South Vietnamese president who fled to exile, his name was, I think, Nguyen Van Thieu, and the 2 other guys, are they cowards, and could have themselves fought back against the communists without American support?
Well, the leadership of the South Vietnamese government that fled in 1975, they were not cowards. They fought until the very bitter end. And it was the United States of America's responsibility to ensure their safety. Now, there's a lot of political views about Vietnam. I personally have one myself. I think the Vietnam War could have been won. The problem, it wasn't won. It was like a stalemate. And it wasn't the soldiers, it wasn't the Marines, it wasn't the airmen, it wasn't the Navy personnel, and there were Coast Guard people there too. It wasn't other countries that supported us. The Australians, they were there, and the Canadians were there. It was pure politics from Washington, D.C. Because we could have won that war and it had been over with. But there was too much political pressure on Nixon and McNamara, who was the Secretary of State, to allow the military to do their job. That's my personal opinion.
So with the growing tension, also with protesters too, you have to remember a lot of people gathered in DC to stop the war because they didn't want to see innocent people dying.
Well, there was a lot of protests back in the United States against the war in Vietnam. But if you were in country fighting to stop the spread of communism, you didn't hear that. We didn't have news people, and it wasn't broadcasted to us. It might have been broadcast back into the States. And we're getting a little touchy here because all of those people that protested, we got to end the war, you're a baby killer, you're doing this. I am not even going to use the words that want to come out of my mouth. I'm saying no. You need to support Vietnam veterans the same way, which the United States never did. When we returned from Vietnam, people spat in our face at the airports, called us baby killers. We got no recognition. But any person that went to Afghanistan and Iraq were treated as heroes. What is the difference? There is no difference.
I mean, the way you're comparing this right now, it's like the Tuskegee Airmen back in World War II, the African Americans. When they came back, they were spatted and they were bullied, remember?
Yes, they were. The Tuskegee Airmen, yes, they were.
That's why Truman desegregated the military. But was there anything for you guys that the president did, like the Nixon, after you guys won, or Ford following him?
Absolutely nothing.
They did nothing to stop it, like Truman.
Nope. We got Marines, we got veterans, Army guys, everything from the Vietnam War that are still suffering. Agent Orange, battlefield fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of them are getting treated, some of them are.
And in today, in 2023, Vietnam, the country is now friends with our nation, the USA, and on better terms with them, rather than how we are dealing with China. So does this come as a surprise in your head?
No, because at the end of any, first of all, Vietnam was never declared a war. It was a conflict. Korea was a conflict. The only wars were World War I and World War II, technically, Civil War. So you could say the same thing when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 7th, 1941. We conquered Japan. Are they our friends? Yes, they are. So having this government of North Vietnam control the country, there has to be amends made somewhere. So yes, you do peace accords with them. We're not going to fight anymore. So yeah, I don't blame that.
That's pretty interesting, and I'm pretty surprised as well. So personally, another personal question I want to ask you: when I got into high school later on, there was another fellow Marine, if you know of his name, Mr. Patrick McMullen. Do you know of him or not exactly? He was a Marine too.
I don't recall. the guy's name. Most of the people that I served with in Vietnam are no longer alive.
Does that mean you were the youngest of your crew?
Yeah, I was one of the youngest. I'm 73.
That's
The people that I physically served with.
that's very much exciting. But in today, you should be happy that here we are. At least some people in Washington D.C. in that memorial, they clean it up for you guys and they respect it rather than spat on it and break it and vandalize it. I barely hear much of these things.
Well, think about the Vietnam Memorial. How long did it take to get that memorial? The war in Vietnam, I call it a war, they call it a conflict, ended in 1975, over 50 years ago. And we're just now getting stuff done. I don't know.
On a final question, in the following decade, the 1980s, there were movies based on Vietnam, like Good Morning Vietnam and a whole bunch of others. Were they accurate with how they fit the description?
No. Probably, and I'm going to, in my personal opinion, the most accurate first part of a movie was Full Metal Jacket, when it started out in Marine Corps boot camp with the drill instructor, taking these Marines and preparing them all to go to Vietnam. That was exactly what boot camp was like. Now, when they got into country, and I say in country, into the theater of operation, some of that stuff that they had with these guys, you know, crazy individuals, I never saw any of that. You know, and did it happen? I don't know. I just know when you fly every day for almost 3 years in a combat zone, it gets to wear on your mental ability, your physical ability, and your common sense, because there were some things that happened over there that I don't even talk about.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that other people, other vets that went there that were on the ground physically doing the fighting have the same feeling. You know, there was a study that came out. One of the worst and most dangerous jobs in Vietnam was a pilot or a crew chief on a helicopter. I have 168 missions logged into my NATOPS manual, and I'm still here. So I think I'm blessed.
Thank you so much for your time, sir. We salute you. With Vietnam and the USA together after 50 years with no fighting anymore, it's safe to say the two countries have made peace and are now friendly with each other in business, and they're even doing better than China when there's no two policies at the moment and are in a less of a threat on this day. Thank you for watching, everyone. I'm Jordan Lee, and I hope to see you watching our next videos.